Hey everyone, welcome to week 5 of Introduction to Sociology. This week we're going to be focusing on deviance. Now when a sociologist talks about deviance, we can mean anything on the spectrum from the extreme end, where we have crime and perhaps behaviours that really harm people, right through to a smaller end where we're just talking about things that are a little bit strange, a little bit silly, and perhaps outside of what's accepted in a particular group. And so today when I'm giving my descriptions of deviance, and we're going to look at 3 different perspectives, I'm going to use an example from the small scale end because we can examine that and then extrapolate quite easily up to the large scale end. Alright, so the 3 approaches we're going to look at today are our 3 lenses for generally looking at sociological ideas. And so they are functionalist, symbolic interactionist, and the conflict or critical perspective. So the example I'm going to use is, imagine, I'm sure you've been part of an established group somewhere, where perhaps it's your social group, or perhaps it's a classroom, say in high school or primary school, something like that, and a new person arrives in the group. Perhaps a new kid in the school, or perhaps just somebody one of your friends has brought in. So in this setting, there is an established social group, there is an established social norms or social expectations. And so we're interested in these social norms because they give space, or they outline what's acceptable behaviour, acceptable thoughts and feelings within a certain context. So those social norms are really important. And deviance takes place when somebody steps outside of those social norms, but just stepping outside of those social norms is not a good enough description for what deviance is. Because in addition to some behaviour, there has to be an interaction where there's a power differential taking place. Essentially, someone has to be able to identify the deviance and then label it as such and make it stick. So that deviance has to be identified as outside the norm by somebody with power. I'll give you an example. So let's take our social group and perhaps our primary school example. New kid arrives in school and they bring something new to that space. Perhaps it's a new item of clothing or a new sport or game to play, something like that. If that sport or game is just accepted, they're not really talking about deviance, that's just a process of change. But if that sport or new clothing or something like that is decided not to be accepted, and the group gives some indication that what the person is doing is not okay, then we have an element of social control. And that's where we're getting interested for this idea of deviance. How are people controlled? How are their deviant behaviours identified and then brought back into or ostracised out of these social expectations? And this social control can happen in a range of different ways. It can happen for anything from a glance. I'm sure you've had somebody look at you and straight away you've known you've done something wrong, or perhaps something is said, or right through to, again, the extreme end like jail, like people being excluded, that's the word I'm looking for, out of a group. So that's the area we're going to be taking an interest in. So let's take this example of the group and examine it through 3 different lenses. So the first lens is the functionalist lens. So from a functionalist perspective, deviance and its identification and the process around it essentially exists to reinforce the social group and their connections. Now you remember, functionalist takes a view of a society where there's a range of different groups doing different things. It's almost like different parts of the body, and they all have to function well together. So if somebody does something deviant, this, from a functionalist perspective, reinforces the well-functioning society. So how does that work? Well, the idea here is, again, take our example of our small social group. If a person comes in and does something that's odd, something strange, and they are told that it's odd and strange, and then they accept that and they bring it back in and they start behaving within the social norms, then what's happened here is that the group has made it quite clear what the boundaries are for the social norms and for the group, and those social group and those social norms have been reinforced. And so the social group and social norms are stronger than they were before. So you can see the deviance acted to reinforce the social norms. Alternatively, the person is excluded from the group. There's that word again, I was trying to get my mouth around. Excluded from the group, and so the group looks at that person from the inside and says, they're different to us, and so we've got a stronger sense of connection here, us two are the same. So you can see from a functionalist perspective, deviance is a process which reinforces social norms and reinforces the good working of that social body. So that's the first perspective. The second perspective is a symbolic interactionist perspective. And for this one, we're going to focus just on a theory called labeling theory. So again, let's take our example of the social group, and they have a new person coming in, and perhaps this person gets labelled as the class clown. I'm sure we've all had a class clown in one of our school groups. Now, the interesting thing that labelling theorists will say about this is it's not actually the act itself that is deviant. The act itself is just an act, but actually what happens is that somebody applies a label to that person and says they are deviant based on that. So again, this is here we're seeing our power differential. We're saying it has to be somebody with the power to give a label and to make it stick. And so in our example of, again, the classroom space, a really easy one to pick on is a teacher. So teachers have a lot of power in this sort of setting, and so they can give a label to a student quite easily. And that label can be carried on across a number of different teachers, a number of different years, if that person is powerful enough. And so that becomes this dominant label for the person. So that's called labeling theory. The last perspective for today is a critical perspective. And the critical perspective, as always, is interested in who has power and who doesn't. So we look at our circumstance again and ask questions about deviance and say, well, in a context of like a classroom, the teacher might have power, and the teacher is able to give a label quite easily. And so you can see that some people in that context have more power than others. But also you can see not only teachers have power, but sometimes certain people have power, certain classes, certain ages, certain genders and sexualities. Those cages that we've talked about before can give different people power in society. So a critical perspective of deviance looks at our society and says, well, who gets given labels in our society? And who has the capacity to reject those labels? And who are the people who are responsible for reinforcing and sustaining them? And so you can ask a question, again using our example of the classroom. If a class has a lot of teachers in it, then the people in that classroom are more likely to have something identified as being deviant. You know, you're more teachers, more likely to see when kids are doing things wrong. Likewise in society, if you have more police in a certain area, you're probably going to get more arrests. You're going to find more crime going on. And so part of the analysis here is saying if we over-police an area, we're going to get a lot more crime. And so we can see this, the presence of people with power can shape how deviance is constructed. That's the idea anyway. It's a little bit tricky, but you'll get the hang of it. Alright, so what I want you to think about as you reflect on this week's video is, have you ever had to conform to a social norm or to conform to an expectation of a group when you didn't think it was a good idea? And so there you can see the power of social norms in action. Have you ever been expelled from a group or witnessed somebody being expelled from a group and seen the group become closer as a result of that? Have you ever seen a label being given or been given a label which then's been really hard to shake? Another good example of this is bullying. You know, once somebody gets identified as being able to be bullied, they continue to get bullied, often very easily. And the last one I want you to think about is for the client groups that we'll be working with, the young people and the people that we might be counselling, what labels do they often receive? And if they often receive labels, who gives those labels? And is there a way for us to think critically about the appropriateness of those labels based on some of our different analysis of power and the way deviance works? So they're the things I want you to think about, and that's a quick overview of deviance from a sociological perspective.